I want to begin by thanking Olivier Meillet, director of the Clark Art Institute, and Carolyn Fowler, director of its research and academic program, as well as the rest of the Clark staff for all they have done to welcome me as a Clark Fellow and to support my research, even in these first few weeks. I feel myself very fortunate to be here. My lecture today unfolds in 6 movements or parts. I first want to begin with an artifact, something quite ancient. Not as ancient as many artifacts, to be sure, but still old enough, 1,830 years, give or take. I am, I suppose, fascinated by things that persist so much longer than I have or will, by the why and the how of their survival, by the fact that their lives are interwoven with mine in ways that mostly evade my knowing. This particular thing is a text, and it has persisted in part by continuing to attract human copyists, whether on its own merits, that of its author, or because it traveled in good company with other lives of saints most often. Where medieval scriptoria left off, printing presses took over as technological prostheses by which such a text could exert its will to survive. This particular text first landed on my desk decades ago in one of its many incarnations, a cheap reprint of a late 19th century English translation. Given my field of study, there is nothing remarkable in that. It would have been more remarkable if it had not come to my attention. And I have taught and written about Jerome's life of Saint Hilarion from time to time. But one day, fairly recently, I looked across at it and suddenly saw it in a new light. I realized it was a kind of postcard, linking not only people, but also places. I wondered for the first time, and then marveled that it was the first time, what it might have to tell me, not about the people, or even the people in relation to the places, but rather about the places themselves. I wondered what it would mean to read this text in such a way as to put the places at the center, instead of the wandering saint on whom the author would have us focus, or so it seemed. I wondered especially about what it would mean to put the Mediterranean island of Cyprus at the center of my reading. For it was in Cyprus that the sender, Jerome, bought the postcard, so to speak, with Hilarion's portrait emblazoned on the front, even if he inscribed it elsewhere in Bethlehem and sent it to correspondents in yet another place, Rome. It was, in some important sense, a Cypriot tale that Jerome's postcard conveyed. If I was suddenly arrested by this arguably rather obvious aspect of the text, it was in part because I had, in the meantime, also visited Cyprus and fallen a little in love with the place myself. But that was not the only reason, of course. Like others becoming preoccupied with the urgencies of our Anthropocene moment, I had found that places were mattering to me more than ever, along with the question of how we humans might think ourselves out of the dangerous box of our own anthropocentrism. I wanted to train myself to read differently, to perceive the world differently, to pluck my eye from my human body and let it roam free, as Beatrice Cortez suggests in a gloss on Claire Colebrook's challenge to, quote, imagine a world without us, a non-human world, a world after the Anthropocene. If we could begin already to learn to perceive post-humanly, so to speak, how might we live differently now? Jerome's life of Saint Hilarion has become my test case, or better yet, my laboratory for this experiment in perceiving differently. This text, which is among the earliest Christian saints' lives, written in Latin, tells the story of a miracle-working ascetic from Palestinian Gaza, who, after a successful career as a founder and leader of major monastic communities, has a midlife crisis and sets off in search of solitude in a journey that takes him all around the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the island of Cyprus, famed birthplace of the goddess Aphrodite, that eventually captured the heart of the restless hermit and held him till his death. And it was following a visit to Cyprus that the ascetic writer Jerome penned the hermit's tale. Historians often confront remains that are fragmentary. In the case of texts preserved only in bits and pieces, our task, as typically construed, is to restore their wholeness. Sometimes the remains resist wholeness, as with the poetry of the archaic Greek writer Sappho, where we encounter an aesthetics of the fragment in which art and accident are now impossible to distinguish. Contemporary translator and poet Anne Carson has made the most of the ambiguity in her edition, If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho, in which the fragments float in the blank space of the page. Still, for text critics and interpreters alike, fragmentation is generally experienced and addressed as a problem to be overcome. This is also a problem of conservation and curation more generally, where the goal is to restore things to what is imagined to be their original integrity or a close enough semblance. In a fascinating set of meditations on decay, cultural geographer Caitlin de Silva observes that curated objects, quote, are preserved most transparently in order to stabilize memory in material form and to stabilize associated identity formations. She asks what it might mean to depart from this tradition, and I'm quoting again, to uncouple memory work from material stability, letting go of our sense of ourselves as autonomous agents, and instead experiencing memory as a collaboration with an array of other materials, forces, and organisms, fluid and emerging. Illustrating her point, de Silva writes of her discovery of a wooden box in a shed on a derelict Montana homestead where she was working as a researcher and volunteer curator. The box was filled with, quote, a grayish mass of fiber and fragments, among which nestled the remains of a collection of leather-bound books. Immediately, she faced a difficult choice. I could understand the mess as the residue of a system of human memory storage or as an impressive display of animal adaptation to available resources. Human library or mouse nest, artifact or ecofact, object to be preserved or trash to be discarded. Her challenge, as she came to understand it, was to embrace both realities and to see both as versions of remembering, entangled in natural as well as cultural processes. In the course of transforming collaboratively into something else, a rodent home, the little library had released its own memories. Structured sentences had broken down into the phrases, words, and letters of which they were originally composed, now circulating freely on scraps of shredded paper. And the paper itself was in the process of returning to its fibrous, woody beginnings. Later, coming upon a similar stew of paper, fabric, and animal leavings in a bushel basket, de Silva composed a poem from the salvaged fragments. De Silva's work leaves both text critics and art historians with some intriguing questions. Is it always our duty as stewards of the past to combat the processes of decay and emergence in which all things are inevitably immersed? Or is a kind of hospice care sometimes the best we historians have to offer? Not resisting those processes, but helping them to unfold as gracefully and mindfully as possible, in such a way as to illumine not just what the objects are ceasing to be, but also what they are becoming. Might we sometimes even feel called upon to assist decay? If at first that sounds scandalous, we quickly realize that it is, of course, both an everyday occurrence and one familiar in the arts, as in the use of spolia or other practices of bricolage. We must break things down in order to assemble something new. Textual versions of bricolage abound and indeed are especially common in the late ancient Mediterranean culture that I study primarily. To take a particularly striking example, Faltonia Betitia Proba, a Latin poet roughly contemporaneous with Jerome, composed a cento consisting of 694 verses culled from Virgil's poetic corpus, repurposed in order to narrate episodes from Genesis, Exodus, and the four Gospels. Simple citation is a more modest and to us more familiar method of textual fragmentation and recombination. It became a particularly important technique in late antiquity for writers steeped in the literature of a bygone age, whether classical or scriptural or both. But when I speak of assisting the decay of Jerome's life of Hilarion, and that's what's at stake for me here, it is not because I'm interested in identifying its sources, so to speak, nor is it because I want to cite the text in any conventional way, although facilitating fragmentation and recombination is precisely my aim. As De Silva points out, conservation strategies always destroy some cultural traces, even as they preserve others, and decay itself may clear a path for certain kinds of remembrance. I am interested in clearing new paths. If we remove the constraints of both time-bound historicity and a human-centered holism from our readings of the life of Hilarion, we may lose purchase on the story of a saint. But we also release the text into a wider range of its own possible becomings and rememberings. As fragments begin to break free, the memories of earth, building, and plant mingle with those of humans. Timescales stretch and shrink. Places slide off our carefully drawn maps. And here's what remains: an earthquake, ruins, a garden. At that time, when an earthquake shook the whole world after the death of Julian, the seas exceeded their bounds, and ships were carried away and suspended on the steep slopes of mountains, as if God were threatening a second flood or everything were returning to the primal chaos. When the Epidaurians saw this, the roaring surges and masses of waves and mountains of swirling waters hurled at the shore, they were afraid. He entered Paphos, the city of Cyprus made famous by the poets, which having often tumbled down because of earthquakes, only by the traces of ruins now shows what it once was. A more remote place, among remote and harsh mountains that could scarcely be climbed by crawling on hands and knees, an exceedingly frightening and withdrawn place. It was surrounded on all sides by trees, and there was also water flowing down from the brow of the hill, a most delightful little garden, and many fruit trees. There was also nearby the ruin of a very ancient temple from which the sound of an enormous number of demons could be heard night and day. In the first fragment I just read, two biblical specters haunt Jerome's representation of a tsunami that threatened the coast of Dalmatia on the Adriatic Sea, a return of the flood that God sent to destroy every living creature, and a lapse back into the watery chaos that preceded the divine creation. The first biblical specter suggests a disastrous event, sudden and traumatic. The second, an entropic process, gradual and inevitable. Both possibilities frame our interpretation of the ruins of Paphos that are on display in the second fragment, and of the garden where the holy man lived with its nearby temple ruins on display in the third. These possibilities are marked not least by their divergent temporalities. As the poet, critic, and translator Susan Stewart puts it in her recent book, The Ruins Lesson, ruination happens at two speeds, furious and slow. We do not have a sense of a moderate or proper pace for ruination, precisely because it is not intended. Sites like Herculaneum and Pompeii are especially disquieting because they compound the effects of both sudden and slow ruin, she adds. The damage of volcanic eruption is succeeded by that of erosion and weeds. In Stewart's words, their slow ruination has been wreaked upon their already destroyed forms. We are seeing double the ruin of a ruin. At times, it may be hard to sustain this double vision. It may be difficult to know where one layer of ruination ends and another begins, which layer to focus on, or how to feel in response. It may be hard to hear all the stories the ruins are telling. Indeed, our impulse is often to drastically simplify and reduce the complex and layered stories, to subject the ambiguities and excesses of our texts and objects to the certainties of our histories and archaeologies. The earthquake that ended antiquity is the headline of a popularizing account of the excavation of Curion, a city located some 30 miles east of Paphos, in whose environs Hilarion made his home. Unlike Paphos, and similar to the more famous sites of Herculaneum and Pompeii, Curion yields accessible and well-preserved evidence of the destruction caused in the late 4th century by a massive earthquake centered just off the southwest coast of Cyprus, leaving Paphos in ruins as well. The authors deliver a story of disaster focused on crisis and transformation, arguing for, quote, the pivotal point that the disaster occupies in history, the turning away from the Ancien Regime, the turning toward Christianity. A 4th century Cypriot earthquake is thus inserted into the familiar story of Rome's fall and Christianity's rise. The authors continue, after the great earthquake of AD 365, Curion sank into the earth and was completely forgotten for a generation until a new wave of Christian settlers gradually repopulated the abandoned site. Here, the earthquake seems to play a causal role in ending antiquity, while also serving as a metaphor for the upheaval brought on by Christianization. A scholarly article delivers a similarly sensational message. After the quakes had literally cleared the scene of the physical pagan institutions, the Cypriot church emerges from the rubble transformed into a dynamic and expansive international force, which is evidenced by the immediate response of church building. Reading passages like this, one almost has the sense that Christianity or its God induced the earthquake, or at the very least, it was strengthened by it. But historical shifts like Christianization are rarely, if ever, that simple in their causes, or that totalizing in their effects. Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, Jerome does not assign earthquake or flood a divinely wrought or in any way pivotal role in the demise of polytheism. He alludes to a larger literary context in which such disasters are associated with the reign or death of the apostate or pagan Emperor Julian, but he does not develop the connection. Instead, his account of the Adriatic tsunami focuses on Hilarion's protective response to human vulnerability. When the frightened people of Epidaurus called upon him, the holy man calmed the surging sea, and having performed this miracle, he simply left, seeming uninterested in converting them to Christianity. Jerome's treatment of the ruins of Paphos is similarly light of touch, and his reference to the apparent army of demons that infested the temple ruins near Hilarion's garden is capped by the curious assertion that Hilarion was pleased to have his adversaries nearby. Thus, our fragments loosen themselves fairly easily from the framework of the triumphalist narrative forged in late antiquity and repeated in recent accounts. As fragments, these bits of text lack clear-cut beginnings or endings. They remain always in process, seeking supplementation, and this fact allows us to pay attention to their open-endedness in other respects. Even the biblical flood did not kill every living creature, and not only because of Noah's heroic act of preservation. As the waters began to subside, the greening branch of an olive tree broke the surface, affirming the resilience of growing things. Nor are chaos and decay the enemy of creation. Rather, they are its matrix. Entropy can be best described as possibility, as De Silva puts it. Death and destruction are real and indeed inevitable, as is grief. No created thing lasts forever, and to love is to mourn. The loss of life in Curion was grievous. On display in the Curion Museum are the bones of a young family, arranged as they fell when their home collapsed on top of them. A man on the right seems to shelter a woman who in turn embraces an infant. In an adjacent room in the same structure, a mule and a young girl had died together. But persistence is real too, and a source of wonder. The tenacity of created things is only matched by the tenacity of our love for them, whether animals, plants, or objects. The structures that we make and tend, and that shape and shelter us in turn, may outlive us by a lot. When they eventually fall, whether quickly or slowly or a bit of both, the story still continues. Ruins do not cease to be homes, whether for plants or holy men who show up and put down roots, even if not invited. At the same time, the materials of made things are broken down and refashioned into new homes, whether for mice or gods. Within decades, perhaps, the columns of the earthquake-toppled theater in Paphos made their way into the structure of a Christian basilica. That basilica was toppled in turn by a later earthquake, and another of more modest size was built in the midst of its ruins. Weeds still grow among those ruins. This story of persistence and emergence troubles the distinction between making and growing, between natural and cultural processes, moreover. Fittingly, the figure of Tisis, or creation, is represented in a mosaic in a bathhouse in 5th century Christian Curion as the bust of an Aphrodite-like figure holding a carpenter's ruler. The image fuses divine and human making, the ongoing transformations of life and art, eros and techne. Things are always in process, and that includes textual and other human artifacts. We try to stabilize them with our histories and our archaeologies, clearing away some layers, preserving others, but even under the most perfect conditions, such as the remains of the earthquake at Curion that lay buried under the rubble for so many centuries, historical objects exceed our knowledge and our control. The process of decay releases textual fragments, like other artifacts, into a wider world of possible encounters. No longer bound by their original literary or historical context, they are free to interact with other texts or objects. We humans can play a role in facilitating those encounters. Mike Chin writes evocatively and provocatively of how, quote, staged, layered, immersive bodily performance can serve as a method of doing historical work. He suggests it is a way of asking questions about the past and about ourselves in relation to the past, insofar as we can feel fragments of the lives of earlier humans and non-humans reverberating in us. This approach requires us to put ourselves, our bodies and affects and imaginations directly into play. They always are anyway, of course, but here, rather than attempting to minimize our implicatedness, we use it with as much artful spontaneity as we can muster. I have already been trying to stage my fragments for you in some modest way, allowing us to immerse ourselves at least briefly in their dramas, so small and so vast at once, and thereby helping them release some of the stories and memories of worlds that they have carried so long and so far. Immersive bodily performance can take us further, as Chin suggests. Chin, who is a puppeteer as well as a historian, sometimes quite literally stages his own performances. What I want to do here is similar but not identical, namely to nudge these fragments into conversation with an immersive and interactive installation in an exhibition that I experienced a little over 2 years ago. That experience has already seeped into my thinking and working, but I have not yet allowed the exhibition and the fragments to speak to each other directly, if I may put it that way, as I hope to do now. Hyperobjects took place in 2018 at Ballroom Marfa, a non-collecting contemporary arts museum located in Marfa, a remote West Texas town made famous in the late 1970s and 80s as a center for minimalist art, when Donald Judd and others were drawn to the area by the stark beauty of the desert and the possibility for large-scale installations that the open space afforded. The show was curated by Laura Coplin, then executive director of Ballroom Marfa, in collaboration with literary scholar and eco-theorist Timothy Morton. It took its theme as well as its title from Morton's concept of the hyperobject as an entity that is so huge in scale as to defy understanding, something like God, but not. Global warming is a prime example. In the words of the curators, quote, hyperobjects create an ecological awareness far beyond normal human comprehension. To understand a hyperobject, we must transform the way we see and experience the universe. In line with this idea, the exhibition seeks to create encounters with artworks and non-art objects that decenter and expand the scale of human perception, end quote. The museum is housed in a whitewashed adobe-style building on one of the main streets of Marfa. Its cool interior contrasts with its courtyard, which was already very hot and very bright in late May of 2018 when I visited Hyperobjects. The courtyard was the site of the installation on which I want to focus primarily. But first, we must don special vests and noise-canceling earmuffs. The Intimate Earthquake Archive was created by Danish artist Sissel Marie Tohn. Drawing on the digital data bank of the Dutch Meteorological Institute, Tohn and her collaborator Jonathan Burrus designed 12 sandstone core samples equipped with long-wave radio transmitters that emitted data drawn from specific earthquakes that had taken place in Groningen, Holland, as the result of natural gas extraction. The core samples were suspended throughout the space of the installation, in this case, Ballroom Marfa's courtyard. As visitors approached each of them in turn, compositions of vibrations played out in their bodies, mediated by the vests, which were equipped with both skin and bone conduction transducers. As Tohn describes the sensations produced by the interface of the vest, with bone conduction, you have the sensation of sound coming from within the body and from no particular direction. Whereas with haptic transduction of the skin, it's really a tactile experience. These different dimensions combine to create a kind of deep listening experience that's internalized through the body, and this experience is strengthened by the earphones that block out all other environmental sound. End quote. The installation is not intended to simulate what an earthquake feels like to a human. If anything, it simulates what it might be like to be the quaking earth. As Tone puts it, the vibrations move across the skin similarly to how the earthquakes moved across the land. The human body becomes a kind of seismogram, an instrument through which the earth can tell its stories, as well as an audience for those stories. In an interview, Tone and Roos discussed their experience of being in West Texas and New Mexico around the time of the Marfa exhibition. Having grown up in Europe and having lived in the Netherlands for so long, going to the Southwest, you just have this sense of presence of the age of the earth. It's just so huge. In a way, it's so biblical. Ancient, vast, and seemingly imperturbable, that landscape around Marfa communicates something of the nature of the hyperobjects that give the exhibition its name. If this landscape contrasts with the relative intimacy of the Netherlands, it also contrasts with the intimacy of the multisensory embodied experience enabled by the interface of the vests. The installation takes something that is too big to conceptualize, human-caused ecological crisis, and makes it manageable and accessible, and thereby even more uncanny and disturbing. We feel it in our bones. It makes our skin buzz. The installation also allows us to experience space not as something to be mapped visually and thereby conquered mentally, which I confess is often how I experience it when looking at a map, for example, but as something to be navigated viscerally. Visually, the installation was not all that compelling, nor was it intended to be, although the simplicity and starkness of the rock cylinders suspended within tripod frames resonated with the setting of the museum's barren courtyard and the desert beyond it. As one moved around the courtyard, visual cues mattered, but the sensations that became primary were the ones mediated by the vest. Space came to be shaped and defined by nodes of vibrational intensity, fostering an almost reptilian awareness as I imagined it. At the same time, the intimate earthquake archive drew very distant and different places close together. The earthquakes of low-lying, rainy Groningen hummed in our bodies as we stood under the hot blue skies of Marfa's high desert country. The convergence of places was made more explicit by the nearby presence of David Brooks' repositioned core byproduct, consisting in the deepest segments of a rock core representing 9 million years of sedimentation, extracted from 1 mile deep in Texas's oil-rich Permian Basin. The elongated prone forms of Brooks' work echoed, extended, and reoriented Tone's shallower, vertically suspended core samples, and reminded us that West Texas, too, is subject to earthquakes induced by oil and gas extraction, in this case, not only drilling, but also fracking. What is vast is also intimate. What is far away is also near. What is near the surface also deep. We are all inside this hyperobject that is global warming. Time, like space, stretches and contracts in this exhibition. A small, highly polished bronze object tucked into the corner not far from Brooks' work caught the eye with the simplicity and elegance of its torso-like twist. The enigmatic object, labeled Equation of Time Cam 01999, was a replica of a part of a massive 10,000-year clock being constructed in the West Texas town of Van Horn by The Long Now, a group co-founded by musician and visual artist Brian Eno. Their stated goal is to, quote, foster long-term thinking and responsibility in the framework of the next 10,000 years. 10,000 years is nothing compared to the 9 million years of sedimentation that produced the rock in Brooks' core sample. But it is also 1 digit more than the millennial units used that typically represent the maximum stretch of human historical thinking. That extra digit is enough to bring an earthquake in late 4th century Cyprus into something like temporal proximity. When I bring my textual fragments into conversation with the intimate earthquake archive, I imagine them like Tone's core samples, coded with data from ancient archives, patient in their suspended state. They await my listening body, and as I approach, their stories reverberate through my bones and dance across my skin. I must open my own memories in order to receive theirs fully. Adriatic and Mediterranean surges mingle with the waves of the Gulf of Mexico that battered the shore of Texas in hurricane seasons during my childhood, and only again last month. The earth heaves and buildings jerk and shudder in San Francisco in 1989, where I experienced the big Loma Prieta quake while pushing my infant in a stroller on the street, as well as in Paphos and Curating in 365, where parents' bodies curled protectively around their own children. And everywhere, in every time, plants push their roots into the dirt, into the cracks of rocks. Trees stretch their branches toward the sky, the persistence of life emergent. If we laid a core sample from Greece's Adonis, the oldest known tree in Europe, alongside Brooks' much longer-reaching geological sample, it would just about bridge the temporal distance between ourselves and Jerome or his saint. With the twist of a strange timepiece, we almost converge, but only almost. The past remains the past, and Cyprus is not Marfa or Groningen or Syracuse or Williamstown, but we can begin to feel its vibrations. We can ask our fragments, as Jen puts it, not only who are you, but also who am I now that I have met you, now that I know your worlds were here beside mine all along. The rather elaborate mediation of the intimate earthquake archive paradoxically creates a greater sense of immediacy and intimacy than the relatively unmediated encounter with the human skeletons on display in the History Museum at Curating. The Curating tableau is moving, to be sure, not least because of the gestures of care and protection almost effortlessly projected onto the delicate tangle of bones. Indeed, our empathy may bridge the temporal gap with dizzying ease as we behold this long-ago moment frozen in time. But that's just it. The scene remains on ice. The earth once shook terrifyingly, but the humans no longer move. Behind glass, they are safe even from scuttling insects and rodents and the prying roots of trees. We view them from a measured distance. These bones have, to the extent possible, been taken outside of the ongoing flow of becoming. They are no longer becoming anything else or more. In contrast, we encounter Tone's non-human, impersonal core samples as active, lively objects that make us feel things in our own bones. Out of place, they bring other places to us, intimately so. Like both the Curating Museum and Tone's intimate earthquake archive, Jerome's Life of Hilarion is, among other things, curating earthquakes. The fragments of text that we have been considering seem to me to be particularly resonant with Tone's installation. Like Tone, Jerome does not offer much by way of historical context, nor does he play on human sympathy in any overt way. What his text offers are vivid but fragmentary snapshots. No narrative arc links and contains the tsunami on the Adriatic and the ruins of Paphos and of the garden and temple in the mountains outside the city. But in each place, we feel vibrations, the vibrations of the earth itself and also of the lives that have left their traces on the earth, lives not only of humans, but also of buildings, plants, and more. It is hard to map that sensation onto the traditional sensorium. Perhaps it is something between touch and nonverbal hearing, but still more basic, like Aristotle's sixth metasense. The relative stillness into which efforts to control global pandemic have plunged us has allowed scientists to sense the Earth's vibrations more clearly. In the midst of upheaval and tragic loss, isolated and often lonely and fearful, we have all been given a chance to do some deep listening to the more than human world around us, as well as to human voices often not heard, raised in protest of racism and injustice. This is our moment, distinctly so. Surely there has never been one quite like it. At the same time, we carry the past with us and beside us as we engage our own moment. Like Hilarion living out his hermit's life in the ruins of a haunted garden, perhaps we can perceive the ghosts that dwell in our own places more clearly in this time of our own solitude. Perhaps we can attend to the places themselves and also to the ongoing processes of becoming other to which all things are subject. Curating earthquakes is like curating decay or upheaval or emergence. Even quasi-canonical texts must be allowed to fall apart and reassemble themselves if livable homes are to be made. Performative, immersive art and reading can help that happen. Thank you.